Hello, everyone. Welcome, good evening, to the Meet a Deaf Professional.
Hello.
So, this event is to welcome our special guest by the name of Pamela Wright. Pamela, this is her sign name. She goes by Pamela. It's an honor for us to have Pamela here, who is a wealth of knowledge about many different topics in relation to bilingualism and dual language and everything that encompasses that. So before we go ahead and dive right in, um, you know, we'll be talking about bilingualism and how it applies to certain things. So, but before we go ahead and do that, I want to make sure that you all know who Pamela is, a little bit about her background, where she's from, and why she's here with us. So, Pamela, go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself.
All right. Thank you for such a sweet introduction. Uh, so, usually, a little bit about myself. I kind of would like to open the floor to see what people would want to know about me. So, if some people in the chat would like to ask questions, and I'm happy to answer those. Um, but while we're waiting for those questions, I think we'll talk about a few things about who I am. I was born and raised in Alabama. Excited to uh, be talking to some other Southerners through Zoom. I really do miss my roots down there. I miss the food as well. The food, so good. Um, Alabama, I lived on I-59 uh, right off there. So about once a year, I would watch the University of Tennessee uh, or we drive to University of Tennessee, University of Alabama, that time of year, you can see them all drive down there. So, yep, from Alabama. Uh, my educational background was all over the place. I was mainstreamed. I went to a school for the deaf. Um, for any parents that might be here, it's important to know that I was born hearing and I became deaf when I was 2 years old.
One person has just requested in the chat if you could go ahead and close your blinds, or perhaps maybe swivel a little bit out of the sunlight.
Hmm. Give me 1 second, see if I can fix something.
Hmm. All right. So that's a good opportunity. So, if you have any sort of those questions about the visual format, or about, like, for example, just imagine that you have Jeopardy music. So, so it's sort of like that, in Jeopardy where you're waiting for the music is playing while we're waiting for folks to get back.
Better?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Oh, someone is sharing their screen. All right. Um, what are the chances of that happening? I just happened to have a big poster from a booth. Um, but I put that and covered the light coming in from the window. So it's all set.
Wonderful.
I forgot where I was.
Yes, you were mentioning your educational background, that you were mainstream and that you went to a deaf residential school. I think you stopped right there.
Sure. So my mother found out that I was deaf, and one thing that was really important to form who I am now is that my mother did find deaf people in our community and asked them, what can I do with my daughter that just became deaf? And um, we found a deaf church in Alabama in Brigham and
Birmingham.
Birmingham. Thank you. And so we got involved in that and found my language developed from there. Um, and who I am today is definitely formed by that decision that my mom made. So my job does encompass language use. Since my first job at 19 years old, I was an interpreter trainer. So I trained interpreters at 19 years old. And from there, my job has switched from an ASL teacher, interpreter training, professional theater. I have taught deaf children for 15 years in different subjects, mostly English though. So throughout all of these, and I worked at a deaf newspaper publisher, and I worked with deaf refugees. And so all of these things encompass language. And so now I teach linguistics at Gallaudet. And so that's what I've been doing throughout my life. I enjoy language, children. There's one story actually. I think I was about 5 years old, and my priest at my church sat me down in a chair and looked straight in my eyes and said, "Are you smart?" I said, "Yes, I'm smart." "You're deaf?" "Yes, I'm deaf." And he said to me, all this work that I've been giving you through church, are you going to give that work and knowledge to deaf children in the future? And she said, yes. And I was 5 years old, so I can't escape my destiny. That was always my goal in the community. So trying to figure out, keep it short and sweet. But if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask.
Yes, I don't think I see any questions in the chat. There are some comments. Nice to meet you. Thank you for sharing with the parents here.
Yes, parents. It's amazing for you to show up. If parents are here, I thank you so deeply.
Great. Okay, now we'll go ahead and start the discussion about the topic of bilingualism. What is bilingualism? So we'll start with the basics. So what does bilingualism mean, from your perspective?
So my perspective, there are definitely different perspectives. You're right by saying that. Um, there's the viewpoint of, the person themselves has expert status in two languages. That person has acquired to the knowledge of two languages and can use both languages in different contexts. But bilingual education, that term is different from what we think of when we think of bilingualism. So when we look at the word bilingualism, one thing that I love to share is that bilingualism is not a switch that you can just turn on and off. We don't have, I'm not using language at all and switch it on, and then I completely turn and use the language on 100%. So I could use English in one context, but I could use ASL in another, and that's not really bilingualism. So it's more of a range of ability. So if someone is fluent in any language, if you ask Spanish, French, any language, Cambodian, and you ask if someone is fluent, they can say, yes, this is fluency and this is not. That's a range that they can identify. But everything in between, where we can say, yes, that's fluency, it's more of a dial that in a wider range. So if we're more, it's clearly, sometimes we can see, all of us can agree someone is not fluent, but there's a certain point at which fluency is a bit less apparent. So again, I like to emphasize that it's not a switch that you can just turn it on and off. So I consider myself bilingual. I can use English in many contexts and I can use ASL in many contexts, but there are some contexts in which I can't use ASL. I'm not good at using ASL in that context. And there's some in which English is, I feel stuck and I can't use that language. So I took a class at University of Colorado. The teacher was Spanish. She was professor of Spanish, and she was great at speaking Spanish. But when it came to sitting at the dinner table, she still sounded like a professor. So that taught us that that's a range. She couldn't just switch that professor voice off when she was at the dinner table. So learning languages is fine. It's a range. Uh,
Different registers.
to register. There's no good or bad in that. It's a process. If you think, well, I'm not at the level I'd want to be at yet, and that's bad. No, we need to appreciate and own the process so we can have a positive attitude when acquiring language, especially new languages, or becoming skilled and fluent in another. That's my perspective.
Perfect. I think what really helps families in the audience is to see you say that. Because I know that there are many of us families out there who just recently started their journey in learning ASL. And I know that sometimes it can feel overwhelming, feeling like, oh, I have to be fluent, I have to be skilled the moment I jump in, or I have to be fluent within 3 to 5 years, or I have to be able to be fluent so that my child can acquire ASL. But everyone on that journey is on some sort of range or some sort of spectrum. So, in relation to bilingualism, I know that there's a lot of discussion about total communication or simcomming. Um, and so some people think that those are the same things, or that is bilingualism. So, what is the difference between, for example, simcomming and, for example, bilingualism?
There's a short answer and there's a long answer. Uh, you can come to my class here at Gallaudet and I can give you the long answer. But for this situation, I'll think of a short answer. So, an example, if you think of a person, a CODA, child of deaf adults, for example, who's hearing, and if they SIMCOM, they talk and sign at the same time, or if there's a person um, who can do that effectively, I think, oh, they're skilled in that. But you can't compare that situation to a new person who is just learning. Most people who are fluent at talking and signing at the same time typically start that skill at a young age. You have to use two different modalities, speaking and signing. When you're simcomming, your brain has to work in double time. Um, so a person who looks fluent in that type of modality has acquired that at a young age. They're a CODA, they're hard of hearing. So I do notice there are people who can speak and sign at the same time, and it looks great, but we can't use that as a measurement. So that's one thing to emphasize when we so deaf children aside, but other people around the world, when we think about when they start to acquire language, it's not a knowledge process. It, it's not a
Conscious.
conscious process when they're starting to learn language at a young age. By 1 year old, 12 months, babies around the world can recognize what their language is and realize that it's different from other languages before they can even talk. They've already recognized and they know that's my language, the one I've been learning for 12 months. So that concept is amazing. So mind mapping for language has already started by 12 months old.
They become conscious of that.
By 5 years old, children around the world have already fully internalized their language. Maybe they don't have all the vocabulary, but the foundation, the structure, that blueprint of language is already in their mind and solid by 5 years old. So that becomes their automacy.
Automaticity.
Automaticity. Thank you. So their brain doesn't have to work to use your first language. It's just an automatic process it just comes naturally. It's like driving. When you learn how to drive, you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many parts to this process. And then one day it's you don't think about the process and you don't think about it when you're driving. So your brain doesn't like to work. It doesn't like much effort. So your brain will put things in the back of its mind as much as it can so that so that these processes can become automatic. So your brain likes this automaticity so that it has room left over to appreciate and learn other things. So I can give you an example from a very well-known bilingual researcher from Boston University. His name is Todd Zubek, Czubeck, and he describes it as if you're driving through a city and it's your first time, you've never yourself been in a car driving through a city, it could be overwhelming. Do you think your friend that's sitting next to you would say, "Oh, look at this, look at that building, look at what's there"? It's like, no, I have to drive. I'm focused on driving. I don't know where I'm going, and it can be a nervous process. But then if you've driven a year in that city, you start developing that automaticity, and you can take the time to sightsee even while you're driving, enjoy the city, watch birds flying by. That's something you're able to do. It's the same thing with language. So to develop that automaticity so that you can learn, or you can have room to learn new things, um, and be flexible. I know I went a little bit on a tangent. What was your question again?
Oh no, that was good. So back to the point was in terms of sim calming.
Okay, thank you. So it's the same idea as a child that's been simcomming. Uh, that's their automaticity. They learned it as at such a young age. So now, if we think of um, if you've been speaking English for 20 years, now you're adding this new language in a new modality, such as ASL. It's not just a different language; it's a completely different modality on top of what you already know. Which one will dominate in that situation? The language that you intrinsically have had since you were young. So for English speakers, their brain will say, "Well, no, I want to. I English is my
Right.
dominant language." And same with me, ASL. ASL feels like my dominant language, so I will forget English in some contexts, and I'll just want to sign. And so those again are two different situations. And my point is, it's about what we have um, inside of us from a young age. And I'm not trying to say, well, oh, no, you can't SimCom because you see a person on YouTube who can SimCom perfectly, and that feels like a conflict when you see that. Um, but you just have to know that they've developed it at a much younger age. I hope that answers the question.
hmm That was wonderful. Thank you. So, in relation to that, I know that there are a few children who are able to switch between the two languages, English and ASL. And at home, it seems like they might lean more towards speaking, with the parents who want to, be bilingual at home. So the children prefers maybe to speak. So how can the family continue to encourage bilingualism in the environment at home if it seems like the child wants to use one language or the other at a time?
Children are beautiful little creatures, and they're sponges. They absorb everything. They want to be familiar. They
Yeah,
want to
mirror.
mirror. They would like to mirror their parents. Um, and all kids, even as young, I would say maybe until they're 12 years old. Then they start to, oh, I don't want to be a mirror to my parents anymore. But when they're little, they want to mirror what their parents are doing. So let me go back a little. Something that's important about language acquisition, that people might think that children need language models, which is fine. Yes, that's true. But hearing children have an unlimited amount of language models and unlimited context. Deaf children, I could say, "Oh, I give you one language model," and that's sticky. That means, for example, they need more people to talk to each other in passing, not just one language model talking at me or signing at me. if you're 4 years old and you see everyone talking to each other and you are the only one that use sign language, you want to mirror what you see around you the most. So that means if a child sees conversations between other people around them, not just me, in sign language, that's incredibly important. They can see interactions and how people interact with each other. That's a completely different context than someone just signing at someone. So for my brother, if you have brothers and sisters, they can sign to each other. That's incredibly important for peer socialization and acquisition for that. So kid to kid interactions and that
Parent to kid as well.
and parent to kid interactions, that would make it more likely for a child to then sign back at home. If children can speak and they speak well, when the speaking and hearing is different. Those are two, that's my speech is my speech makes me sound hard of hearing, but my ears, I'm on this audio audiology graph. I'm audiogram. I'm right at the bottom, all the way across. So my speech doesn't fit my ability to hear. So to measure me by my speaking abilities, I have no input then. So some hard of hearing kids can speak very well. They have cochlear implants. That doesn't mean that they get the same efficiency, is a good word to use. It's not the same efficiency when they hear sounds around them. When they speak, it might sound efficient, but it doesn't. It's not the same when they're trying to hear. So those are two reasons I think that might happen. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, perfect. Okay. So I have one question. It might be a little funny to answer. Is there any difference between bilingualism at home and bilingualism at school or in the education setting? You touched on a little bit about that, but could you go in a little bit deeper about that topic?
Sure. One caution that I might mention is that bilingual education, or teachers that teach in English and ASL as a second language, the goal of that program and that environment is that kids that are bilingual at home, they will be monolingual at school. So it's fine if they're bilingual at home, that's great. But at school, they must know how to use English. So their goal in teaching them English is to teach them enough so that they can then transition to a regular classroom. So that's their goal. When deaf educators ask for bilingual schooling and education, sometimes you have to explain exactly what you want. Because, okay, so I'll increase their English skills and English instruction. And it's the philosophy contradicts each other. If hearing schools would use both languages, you would call it dual language schooling. So that means in one class it's German and the other it's English, and that is called dual language as opposed to bilingual. So it's right there, right? Bilingual at home is different than school and in practice. So at home, so again, maybe ASL aside, but if we were using Spanish and English at home or French and German at home, kids will learn who in their home is talking in that language. They'll learn in which situations do I use which language. So they'll learn how to code switch for certain skills and for certain people in their context. So they learn when and how and where and who, how much to use either language. So that's bilingualism at home from everything that they see and are exposed to. So children that use ASL, if they have signed models, they'll acquire in the same exact way. If they have more models that sign, they'll acquire it even more with practices. They get more practice as well. If we're talking about a dual language schooling, then that's a different teaching approach as well. So typically schools will decide when we use one language and when to use another. But is that good for deaf children? Maybe not. We need to make sure that they have access to sign and visualizations all the time. And then in English, they need to have the visualizations for English as well. So both of them have to be accessible visually. Even if someone is hard of hearing or implanted, they need that visual support in conjunction with learning English. So it's not the same. Sometimes we have to accept that we can't compare two things. We as signing people have our own needs, and it's separate from other spoken languages.
Beautiful. So we're getting close to the last question. So then afterwards, we'll switch over to Q&A. So I know that you have a lot of knowledge in regards to IEPs in general. So if a family decides to have their child go to a mainstream school, how can they use IEPs, or how can they support their child in getting, for example, some level of um, dual language in a mainstream setting? So a personal question is that, is it possible to do that? Mainstream schooling, but also providing some sort of dual language education?
So I'm not in K through 12 anymore, so I can give you a more honest answer. So I've already sat at every seat in an IEP meeting that you could be in. I've been in every role. I've been a parent, a student, a teacher, an assessor, an administrative representative, all of these roles, and an advocate, even. I've done and been those all of those roles, and each one is different. So each person at that table has a different mindset of what's going to happen at that IEP meeting. Parents sit there and we want the best, top notch education for our children. Well, who doesn't want that, you know? So we as parents have a hard time wrapping our minds around the concept that administrators in the school system does not want the best for our students. They might say so in the moment, but laws limit so much of what administrators can say. Administrators can't offer multiple options that they don't have if it's already established in their system. Administrators can't, and assessors can't go off blueprint.
Off script.
If they go off script, they become legally liable. So if parents could understand that they're not able to be fully transparent with us, then we can work around their limitations. So that's one thing. You know, again, every person at that IEP meeting has a different mindset. And then I think I found this out when I was about 41 years old, before I fully understood that what I was saying. And I was nervous to be a teacher by the time I realized, you know, I'm an IEP baby. I was the first kid in my county to be mainstreamed with an interpreter. I was mainstream without an interpreter, but in that county, I was the first with. So I'm an IEP kid, and I still have a copy of my old IEP. Actually, it's one page, one single page, super nice. Imagine if they were one page these days. One form with some written lines and some check marks, and that's it. And there's a copy of it with it. So amazing. Now it's 50 pages and it's like a book. So I was an English teacher. So I would do 60 IEPs a year. Oh. Yeah. So, but one thing I found out about halfway through my teaching experience was that IEPs are not designed to maximize a child's potential. They're really not. It was designed to provide a free and appropriate public education, but who decides what's appropriate? It was designed to put a child in the classroom with the least support first. That was the goal. Kids, if they could function up to 2 grade levels behind where they were at, uh, the school was not obligated to provide more support for them. So that meant if the child was in 5th grade, but they read and wrote at a 3.7, the school in that class, the school is not legally obligated to provide more support to that child. It doesn't matter how much we scream and ask for it as parents. So that frame, understanding that perspective is incredibly important. Parents want the best. Schools are legally not obligated to provide that. So parents have to figure out how to negotiate that. It's awful. I feel like that should never happen or never have happened, but it's the fact of the matter, and it is what it is. And it affects at the college level as well. Colleges now have that attitude of, we provide the minimum. If I've met my legal responsibility and I provided the minimum at the secondary level. So that's the second important thing to know. The third is to be aware that most states, and sorry, I don't know Tennessee's, I would recommend you to check that for yourself. It's different per state. But each state, a hearing child would get as much money from the state, or the school would get money from the state per number of children. So maybe the state would give, you have 200 students, the state would give this much amount of money per child. So that's why schools need you to show up, and so that we can count the days and they can get the appropriate amount of money for each student. And some states with disabled students on IEPs will get 4 to 7 times more money from the state. So again, if you have 200 per child, maybe there's 10,000, maybe there's 8,000. So money comes with kids. It follows them everywhere. So in some districts, not even the state, school districts don't want to let go of that. And that's just honest. So parents need to learn how to work with those 3 things that I just mentioned. If you want more information, I'm available to talk more about that. Sorry if that's awful news to some of you, but that's the truth.
I want to thank you. It's good to know the reality of the situation and to know that early instead of much later. Yes, thank you. I learned a lot tonight myself, so thank you for that.
Oh, sorry, I have one more actually.
Mhm.
Parents have the right to ask for a transition plan for kids when they become 14. So you don't have to wait until their senior
What
year.
do you mean by a transition plan? Some parents may know and some may not.
Sure. So a transition plan is what do you do after you graduate high school? My stepson has a disability and he graduates this May. So I started fighting for his transition plan when he was turned 14. And finally, we met about that 2 weeks ago. So that's where that's not okay. And we know that. But some schools will put it off, put the transition plan off because of whatever reason it may be. But the transition plan is a plan for what to do after high school. So, is the child going to stay longer? Do they need more schooling? Do they need to stay until they're 20 and get extra reading and writing skills? You don't have to be locked in when you're 14, but I think you should be strict. Start being strict about it when you're 14. Find your resources. What resources are available for my child? Please let me know what these are so that I can start when when my child turns 14. So it's about ninth grade. That is your right.
I see a comment in the chat. A person saying, "Thank you for speaking the truth."
Yep.
Okay, so now, yes, kids need that.
Yeah, I'm happy to help.
Okay. Another parent says, um, "That is so good to know. Thank you." Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and bring it over to the Q&A. So again, I do want to remind y'all that families can ask questions first. And then once families are done, we'll go ahead and open the floor to community members, professionals, students, etc. So are there any families that would like to ask a question? Please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can turn on your screens and sign or speak, whichever you prefer. So I'll go ahead and wait. I see something in the chat. How can families and professionals make sure the child is actually receiving slash accessing sufficient early language? So that, um, and also there was some context afterwards.
Yeah, I'll read the rest.
Okay, go ahead. So so it says, based on who decides what access means, professionals often say children are getting services just by being exposed, surrounded by a language-rich environment. Matthew Hall has attempted to tease out how to measure children having access. Being surrounded by ASL or cued speech does not guarantee that the child will internalize what surrounds them. So it's like a tower sending radio waves. The child needs to have an antenna that takes the waves and sends it to the brain. So that was the context of that question. That's a tough question to answer, I
That's
think.
a good question. I I'm gonna leave the question up just so I can keep it right in front of my face and in my mind while I'm answering. So in the linguistics field, we haven't decided what fluency means officially. It's a very subjective concept. So, right, fluency being subjective, that means also what could act that excuse me, interpreter. What access, what could it be?
Mhm. Um, yes, please go ahead and repeat what you just said, please.
So, fluency is subjective, and we have a clear idea of what yes and no is, but again, what in between could be counted as fluency. So yes, sometimes that could be fluent, but maybe not that. And so that range that we were talking about at the beginning. And access is a similar concept. I In an ideal world, I would say access to as much and everything as possible around the children. You don't know what little information could be missing and it could affect something. So in my department in linguistics, we all sign at Gallaudet. About 3 weeks ago, I sat down and was chatting with one of the professors who was a hearing professor. We were signing and chatting, and another hearing teacher came up to us, and the two hearing professors started talking about how to fill out a form for travel and getting money to fund that. And I was watching, and in that moment, they were signing to each other. I was so grateful that I had coworkers who would sign in front of me because one day I'll need to fill out a travel form myself. I won't have to go and, ask people for help and field that information. I can remember that conversation that I was exposed to. So all of that information is important. Another example could be those of us who went to deaf residential schools, mainstreamed, who had deaf parents or not. We could be, we were discussing, mm, so, so it doesn't matter who, but so if a child is deaf, often their parents will discuss where are we going to go? We're going to go to the grocery store. Um, so the hearing brothers and sisters in that family could hear that, but they already know what they need to put on and wear. They need a coat and shoes, and uh, they already have that awareness and that incidental learning of what to do next, what's coming next. So that's a small bit of information. But the deaf child will often, uh, chatter will be going on. It's like, okay, where are we going? And everyone in the family knows that we're going to the grocery store. The deaf child, though, doesn't know. But they didn't know that the deaf child didn't know. So they learn to just follow and trust teachers that say, come on, coming out of the classroom, and students follow. They just follow everyone else. And these deaf children need to develop autonomy. Just letting them know we're going to the grocery store, and the kid then can think, oh, I have an anticipatory skill of knowing what might come next. That will never be put in an IEP. Schools will not put that as a goal in an IEP. So that natural uh,
Acquisition.
acquisition, sorry, of incidental learning is so important, and it starts at home.
And just to add a little bit to that, I was thinking a lot about, and I love the example. For example, going to the grocery store and explaining to your deaf child what exactly it is you need to do in order to prepare for that. Because oftentimes, what happens is that you'll tell the deaf child like, okay, we're going to the grocery store, and then maybe you might have to stop by and get gas, or maybe you need to talk to the siblings as well. And so what happens is you pull into a gas station and the deaf child is now confused. Why are we at a gas station? I thought we were going to a grocery store. And then what happens is sometimes there might be a tantrum or some sort of backlash because there wasn't that communication of the string of events that was going to happen, which is very important to inform the deaf child of, oh yes, we're running out of time, so yes, let's turn to the questions. I see a ton of questions, which is great. The first question is, it says, by Azucena. So are deaf schools also obligated to keep kids on track? Why are some better than others depending on the state?
Uh, Honestly, every school has a different story. Every school, every program has a different philosophy, has different success stories that they put at the forefront, and they use it as a model, and they say, look at this success story. But behind that success story, there's so many other factors that went into that. And those factors are the things that we need to pay attention to. Now, all schools are obligated to keep deaf kids on track. The question then becomes, what does that mean? What does on track mean? On grade level, making sure they're independent, on grade level modifications, on grade level with extra support, on grade level with extra support with modifications. And so, what does on track mean? And parents and teachers might not have the same idea when it comes to what that means. So, when you want your kid to be on track, that's fine. You ask the school, well, what do you use? How do you measure? How do you decide what that means? And my idea of on track is this. Are you doing this? If the answer is no, okay, so what do you do to get children to get to what your definition of on track means? What are my options? If they won't give into the request for options, okay, find an advocate. If you won't give me options, or if you don't like their options, we have to look for an advocate. And there are advocates around who will explain to you how to deal with the system.
Great, perfect. Thank you. And so now I'll go ahead and sign Lacey's question. Have you had any experience in witnessing a deaf child in a deaf school switching to mainstream and then switching back to deaf schools due to various reasons? For example, not enough support, the school's not able to provide means to reach IEP goals, etc. If so, any insight on how that switching might affect the social, emotional needs of the child? Any other insight or recommendations? My child is only a first grader, and we have no intentions of mainstreaming her anytime soon, but wondering about the future and what she might want. Any insight is helpful. Thanks.
That kind of goes back to the beginning where I'm a product of so many different environments, so I'm a little biased. I think what works this year might not work next year. Maybe that teacher just isn't great. Maybe there's a new administration. Maybe the child himself is just curious about different options. Most deaf schools, I suspect in Tennessee it's similar, but don't trust me when I say this. Most deaf schools will have part-time mainstream programs. So you go to the deaf residential school in the morning, and then you take a couple classes at the local mainstream program. I went through that experience. I went to a deaf day school first, and I wish that they never closed that school. It stays in my heart till this day. But I did the day program at the deaf school, and then I was in a self-contained. I was self-contained, and then I was mainstream part-time, and then I was mainstream full-time with no contact with other deaf students. Up to 5th grade, it wasn't bad. That system, I think when I was young in elementary school, it didn't feel like much, but then when I got to middle school, I had all this wordplay with language, that challenge of experimenting with social skills at that age, and I was learning how to fight and disagree with people, lie, gossip, how how to agree and disagree, solve, how to flirt, how not to behave, all of these things encompassed, and peers checking on each other. Uh, that's where deaf kids often hit the wall. Not always, again, not always, but some kids just hit this mental wall. All of these nuances come clashing together. And then if you have an adult following you around in that environment, that those kinds of things, maybe it works one year and another it doesn't. When I was in junior high, I went back to the deaf school. I wanted to cheerlead. I wanted to be involved in my classes. I wanted to travel to different states. Deaf schools often travel to other states for sports or activities. I wanted to be involved in dance and performance. I wanted to be a teenager, and the deaf school gave me that experience. The mainstream school did give me academics, so it's push and shove, and you don't have to be stuck in deciding one thing. What if it works, it works. Keep going with it. There's nothing wrong with that. Just leave the child if it works. I just met one of my students and found out yesterday they went to a deaf school from 18 months old all the way, uh, and now she's at college in Gallaudet and she's happy. So some kids, all kids are different. I hope that's good.
That's great. Let's see. There's a few more parents that are saying thank you. We love your stories or sharing your story. And so the last question for the night is, and this is from Angelina or Angeline. I have a question about children learning more than one sign language. My husband is German, and my oldest son is bilingual in English and German. My 2-year-old is hard of hearing with progressive hearing loss and is learning English, German, and ASL. I want to add Sign German or DGS so that he has the same opportunities as his brother. I suppose my question is this completely unreasonable?
No, go for it. Go for it. Really, I'll share um, with Brielle. It's a video of my favorite group. They talk about linguistics and language acquisition. It's called Lingspace, Lingspace on YouTube. You can find them. And they have one video on bilingualism. And it's a very cute, clear description of babies that can and will build uh, walls between languages. Babies, well, you get concerned, oh, am I going to confuse my baby? No. Babies will, it might, they might seem to switch back and forth, but that's while they're acquiring both languages. When they get enough exposure, they have their brain has clear distinctions between, it's like superpowers in their brain, and they're developing these buckets that they're throwing all this language information into. So they will not get confused. I say go for it. That's great and fun. I love that.
Great. Okay. So I apologize to our community members, our professionals, and our students who didn't have an opportunity to ask their questions since we've run out of time, but maybe we will be back again later. Pamela will be back again later. We'll
Yeah,
see.
you're happy to.
So I want to thank you, Pamela, for spending time with us tonight, sharing your perspectives, your thoughts, your knowledge, and I've learned a lot from you as well, and I'm sure from the comments that people have as well, and they're very thankful.
Yeah, I thank you all as well.
I want to thank our interpreters for tonight. Much love to you too. And if anyone wants to go ahead and turn on their cameras to say hello, sign I love you in ASL,